Welcome, everybody. We're here today to talk about the kinds of live services technology that are required for multiplayer PvP games. And just to be clear, we're going to be talking about online services, so things like accounts, matchmaking, player stats, or things like that, rather than the multiplayer networking side. And specifically, we are going to be talking about one, what are the key issues and challenges to pay attention to for scale PvP games like Riot's League of Legends, or CCP's EVE Online or Epic's Fortnite when it comes to these online services. Two, what current tools exist and what are the biggest technical challenges to solve them? Three, cross-platform considerations, challenges, trends. Four, matchmaking challenges. Six, reputation and behavior. And seven, just general scaling challenges. And with us today to speak about all of these issues and more is the newly funded startup, Pragma.gg. Welcome, guys, and thanks so much for joining us today. Yeah, I thought we could first start just by having Eden, you introduce your team, or have each of you guys introduce yourselves, just given like the really fantastic backgrounds that you guys have in the games industry.
Yeah, for sure. Hey, I'm Eden. Thanks, Joseph, for hosting this podcast and for GG Digest. Huge fan of the weekly newsletter. Background is so pro gamed in high school before esports was a thing, and mainly was just a huge waste of time, according to my parents. Got into programmatic trading when I was in college. It's just like the closest thing to playing a video game. Then I realized that trading had no real impact on the world in a positive way. So got out of that after running a hedge fund for a few years, and started a development agency that helped build a lot of kind of early stage startups in LA that are well known today, and work with a lot of the kind of Fortune 500 consumer and entertainment companies for the last 8 years. Had a desire to get back into games, and Chris and I had been friends for a long time, and here we are. That's a quick version of me.
Yeah, hey, my name's Chris Cobb, and got my start working on back-end services at Microsoft, working on advertising technology. My passion was always in games, though, so when I got the chance, I hopped over to PopCap Games, where we worked on back-end services for early social mobile games on Facebook and iOS. From there, I joined Riot Games in 2012 to work on their back-end services and platforms with a particular focus on player behavior. So how do we address toxicity and hate speech and those kinds of things? Spent a bunch of time on matchmaking as well, supporting League of Legends across a bunch of different areas. Got the itch to kind of head out on my own, and that's where Eden and I started spending more time together as he advised me on my first startup effort. We focus on educational games and trying to bring that social services kind of ecosystem alive in a different domain. And as we wrap that up, Eden and I decided to kind of venture out and start working on this back-end services product, at which point we teamed up with a few folks who had worked together at Riot, including Nick. So I'll just hand off to him.
Thanks. My name's Nick. I'm a long-time game developer. Got my start in mobile games before iPhones and Android were invented, back in the good old days, or terrible old days, depending. Decided that I wanted to branch out into a more complicated distributed system, so studied that formally, got a master's in that domain, and then married my passions for distributed system and games by taking a job at CCP working on the backend servers for EVE Online. And I worked out of CCP's office for almost 5 years, doing high scaling or complicated scaling game systems for them. And then joined Riot, and I spent almost 6 years writing backend systems, microservice support frameworks, and all sorts of scaling efforts over there. Met Chris, met a bunch of other amazing folks at Riot, and then when they wanted to start their startup, then we talked together, and it was a perfect fit for me, so I decided to join them. Yep.
So it sounds like you guys all, it seems like the common thread between the three of you guys is Riot. And it's great that you guys have the experience both in terms of the back end and online services, both at Riot and on EVE Online at CCP. So maybe you guys could tell me a little bit about the current startup before we jump into all the other issues, as far as like, what is the thesis behind Pragma? Or, why did you guys, leave Riot to start this company, and what in terms of the problem that you guys are solving and how it may relate to some of the topics that we're going to talk about today.
Yeah, I can kind of kick this off. I think all of us are really passionate about games, and that's not just us three. Our whole team, we wanted to make a game. We all of us are interested in making games, and think after talking to a bunch of friends at different studios, I think we realized that everyone was sort of saying the same thing. Number one, a lot of them wanted to outsource the platform piece of what they were doing. These are for live service games. Number two, the existing solutions didn't really give them the control that they needed to kind of feel comfortable launching that, and those solutions didn't allow them to scale. And then number three, when they rolled their own platform, it ended up being like multiples of the magnitudes more complex and expensive than they thought it would be.
Yeah.
So I think the thesis really is that there's going to be more multiplayer games and live services games in the future. I think like that's sort of a trend that we're seeing in games, but that's not really, it's like multiplayer games have been around for 20 years, and I think we're just all fans of multiplayer games. So I don't think we're trying to chase a trend necessarily. It's just we all love multiplayer games. They're super hard to make today, and we hope we can be one piece that simplifies the ability to make those games.
Got it. And so just kind of moving then to the first topic, which is really around what are some of these key challenges then in terms of whether it's folks who are trying to roll their own solution. What are the key challenges that you guys are working on that you think would be, and clearly you guys have the pedigree and the background in terms of what you guys have worked on, but what is it that's going to be very difficult for some other game studio to develop that you guys are going to be tackling?
Yeah, so to paint the really big picture here, I think that right now when you're trying to create a large scale online multiplayer video game, you both have the creative effort of building something like, as creative and fascinating and as exciting as a Pixar film. While at the same time, you have to build the backend technology to support like distribution and platform and online services. So it's like trying to tackle, being a creative studio and a technology company all at once, right? And so it's tough to do either one of those well.
Yeah.
And trying to do both at the same time, you have to build basically two different business units, almost two different teams, two different organizations. Is very hard to pull off. And for those backend services, those things are necessary but not sufficient. They have to work, and they should just be silent, and nobody should even notice that they're there. But if they don't work, you have these really high-profile launches where a game comes out and everyone's excited about them, but the servers go down and players will spend days or weeks just waiting for their chance to even play the game, let alone determine whether it's great. So I think that at a fundamental level, we have to create this really complex technology to power a great game experience, and doing both at the same time is real tough. In terms of building that team, you're competing with the big tech shops, the Amazons and Googles and Facebooks. And one, that's really difficult from a talent perspective. And second, those expertise, you need somebody who can do the large scale backend systems, but also has a passion and excitement for games. And so finding, those folks who have both definitely is a challenge. One thing we like to distinguish between is the in-game experience. That's your 3D graphics engine, your online multiplayer, your game networking from your out-of-game systems. And these are like the metagame and your progression and your rank systems and your matchmaking and your friends list. So those are the areas that the online services tend to cover, those out-of-game systems. But the two kind of have to work in concert together to kind of put all the pieces there. And in practice, for a studio trying to pursue that, you're going to have to hire just basically the same number of services engineers as you hire game engineers. So not only is it hard to find those folks, but you need a lot of them. And that's because we make living games now. This is not like build it once and then, spin that down. Most big studios will build a large services team that, will live indefinitely.
Right. And so when I look at your website and then look at some of the services that you guys are working on, account services, game loop, player data services, social systems and achievements, platform services, store, like which of those in your opinion, what's like the most challenging part, and what's like the technical issue underlying the challenge behind implementing, whichever one of those services would be the most difficult for, a game studio to develop on their own?
Yeah, I guess I'll briefly just note that one, there are a lot of them, and they have to work in concert
Sure.
with another.
Yeah.
So part of the challenge is surely the scope. There are different flavors, so I think we will break down different pieces of that as we
Okay.
develop. Yeah, and I think that it might be helpful to kind of tackle what is out there for folks, what tools and services are available to
Sure.
kind of set the stage for then driving into
Got
all
it.
the
So
bits.
then, yeah, so maybe we could talk about that. And as far as I know, in terms of like online services, when I think about some of the external third-party guys out there, you think of companies like PlayFab, think of companies like GameSpark. Certainly, Epic announced that they're going to have their online services. I'm not sure if they support mobile yet or not, but
Not yet, but they plan to. Yeah.
they plan to.
Mm-hmm.
So could you guys speak in terms of like, how would you characterize the current players out there? Are those like the primary players? Who else is out there? What do you think of the services that are currently out there right now?
Yeah, I mean, so there's sort of like what you mentioned. I think the PlayFab, GameSpark's EOS, which is Epic's kind of new effort. I think all of us, if you look at like sort of the feature set,
Yeah.
it's going to be pretty similar.
Okay.
That stack of things, and those are again like these are kind of online services that we're talking about, anywhere from like account services to inventory stats, all the social features, and then the game loop, which is the lobby experience, all the way to like game allocation and then out of game experience in terms of looping it back to the platform side. So I think in terms of those services are very, very similar. And then outside of that stack, we would interact directly with the sort of like game server stack. I think you mentioned briefly like Photon as an example, which might be used.
Oh, you mean for the multiplayer?
Yeah, on the multiplayer side,
Okay,
we would
got it.
engage kind of with the game server kind of networking side, which
I see.
sort of like is the Photon layer, and then so there's a lot of different, and then there's also server management or fleet management, which multiplay handled for Apex, which is like really like where the actual data centers are located, and then like which data centers to spin up or which servers to spin up in which location when you start a game, and then there's other new companies that are handling that, like GameEye is some ex multiplay guys that launched to do something similar, and then you also have sort of like the simulation layer, which is the improbable. There's a new company called Incoherence, I believe that's targeting that space. So there's a lot of different moving pieces here, and we're focused on that platform side, which is again pretty similar to the EOS, PlayFab, GameSparks, and obviously we can talk about what we felt like we could contribute to the space, but just wanted to sort of lay out all the different pieces just to
Right.
get you to the game.
Right. And so, yeah, so let's talk about that part then. So how would you guys differentiate yourselves from a PlayFab GameSpark? Because it sounds like these are the closest comparisons, right? The PlayFab's GameSparks and EOS. And then from the Epic side, since those guys are crazy and they're offering their stuff for free, what part of your solution would entice game developers to pay for some other solution? And by the way, I don't know much about Epic's solution. I don't know if it's any good or not, but please let me know.
Everything Epic does is good.
Yeah, so like when you look at all those different moving parts and you're trying to piece them all together and tie them together,
yeah.
I think that an analogy I think that would help kind of put this all into context is the game engine. Back in the day, we didn't have these really high quality game engines. So if you wanted to build a video game, you also had to build a graphics engine and all of those tools and layers. And what we found is as Unity and Unreal became more mature and more available, then now those don't make a video game for you, but there's thousands of engineering years behind that technology that allows you to build on top and create much more sophisticated experiences.
Yeah.
So when you go to the services side, we don't have anything like that today. There's no toolkit, there's no framework for you to build on top of. And so people end up having to start from scratch. So the current offerings that are available now are what we call managed services, which is any of these companies have built a set of tools, and they host them on Amazon or Google Cloud for you, and you can plug into that. And the nice thing about that is it gets you going very quickly. But the next step, though, when your game has custom needs or you're trying to do specific features or rich, deeply integrated features, the challenge becomes if it's somebody else's service, it's a lot harder for you to customize. So with Unreal Engine, you get the actual source code. And so on the one hand, you can just use it as is, but on the other hand, you can go under the hood and make those modifications that you need specific to your game. So when you look at a title like Riot's recently released Valorant, because that game is very specific as a tactical shooter, the need to go into that networking layer and make that thing do exactly what's needed for that game experience is possible with a game engine that allows you source code access like Unreal. So when we look at the landscape today, it's really easy to get started on one of these services. But the challenge becomes when you have specific needs, it's a lot harder for you. You make a feature request of another company and they've got their own priorities and their own schedule, as opposed to having full control. And so that's kind of the angle that we took was, hey, let's create the game engine for backend, which is we have a group of folks who've built these systems for a long time, but then make that source code available for folks to utilize so that they can extend it and build on top of it and customize it.
Yeah, so one of the advantages with you guys is there would be source access, but from like a features or functionality or scalability perspective, is there any why in addition to the customization, which is a big deal, is there any other way that we should be thinking about the advantages of using what you guys are doing, or could you help for some of us, because I work with a lot of kind of higher level guys, product managers, execs. And so if I'm a product manager or an executive trying to understand your solution relative to EOS, relative to PlayFab or GameSparks, how should I be thinking about like the relative strengths and weaknesses of each of these solutions?
Yeah, I mean, I could speak very briefly and then have these guys kind of go into the details. But I mean, I think the devil's really in the details of something like this. I mean, I do think the features are going to be very similar in terms of what's stated. If you look at our sites, you'll probably see like a very similar set of features. But I'll just like give you an example of like if you're, for example, for us, as we build out like just something simple like the SDK layer. There's a lot of different things that we noticed that would be really, really helpful for us as we, build something like that. For example, like no reference implementation, no ability to see like best practices, and the ability to do something like mocking or the ability to do something like state caching. So I think when people actually start to use tools, the actual feature sets are not different, but the ways that we approach something like the SDK I just mentioned are going to be pretty different.
Right.
I'm not saying like we're necessarily better or worse, because again, like some managed services are going to make a lot of sense for example, like the use case for PlayFab that's worked very, very well is that you're a indie mobile developer and player data is extremely important part of what you're doing, but you're maybe not a live service multiplayer game. Now, something like saving game state or something that may be like extremely relevant for something like PlayFab, and like using our solution would not make sense for that. You wouldn't want to roll like this large platform that's dealing with lots of different things. You may just want game state and where saving the last place that you were in your game, and that's like all you want to do. And you don't want to manage your own infrastructure. You don't want to host something on AWS yourself. So that's not going to make sense for you. So that's a situation where like a PlayFab will make a lot of sense. So it's more the approach that we're taking is a little bit different. So I'll pause. I don't know if Chris or Nick, you guys have any.
I mean, I can talk to that a little bit. Yeah. I think if you look at the PlayFab offerings, and I'm using PlayFab, but it's the same for EOS or any of the hosted offered building block services, right? What they offer you is exactly that, building blocks for your thing, and within one flavor and one set of assumption that they've decided is the way to do things. And Eden is right. For some games, it will certainly be a very good fit, right? You're going to find yourself with like the perfect GameSpark use case or something, and it will just work. I think the Pragma idea is that we want to give the developer that sense of control, that if they want to make a rich game experience that isn't already decided by how EOS has laid out its matchmaker, right? It is completely possible for you to do that and to create that rich experience. It's not possible. You're not going to go and knock on Epic's door and be like, "Hi, I would like to modify EOS right now to do my thing," right? That's not, it's not realistic. But if you have access to source code for Pragma, you are completely empowered to do that. The hope is that because we're prepackaged, kind of holistic in how we bundled all our services together, the cost of doing that for a studio is very low. So we're what I think one of the nice things that Prime was going to offer is that ability to, at very low cost, customize an online game experience. Chris' analogy is correct, right? It's the Unreal or the Unity idea where you don't have to be the world's leading 3D programmer to make a 3D game in Unreal. It used to be the case that you had to be, but it's not the case anymore. So making that amazing backend rich experience without having to hire 10 Google top tier engineer in your team and blow your whole studio budget on that, is what I think would be the biggest difference there.
And so can you guys help me understand, like, could you give me like the profile of the type of game or the type of game studio that would pick you guys versus an EOS versus a PlayFab?
Yeah, so to touch on that, I think that one of the characteristics we also aspire to is that achieving massive scale. Having worked on some of these giant video games, the challenge is to build that custom up front for a studio that's not sure they're going to be successful is a very high cost. But what you will struggle with is if you happen to take off and you start to become successful. If your platform can't scale with you, you're in a really tight spot because now you have to kind of play catch up. But you're at that moment that you're trying to realize success. So you launch your game, everyone loves it, and they all show up. But if your platform can't support you, then that's the moment in time that you have to start building, which is kind of a frightening prospect. On the other hand, you have to be, you have to have really large capitalization if you're going to go build that up front due to how expensive and time intensive it is to build. So the customers that I think we target early on, especially as our product comes to life, would be folks who are pretty well capitalized that come out of maybe a AAA tradition who are now going independent. Yeah. So, we might call these double A's or triple I's. These are folks who have experience building, large scale video games, but might not have the experience in online services. Now, I think we do also aspire, a lot of making this accessible to people is how do you run this thing in a way that's straightforward if you're not already a services expert. So even our early customers, we're still striving to offer a degree of simplicity in how this is operated that is quite different than most kind of like complex technical products. Our hope then is that as we grow and expand our feature set, that we become more and more accessible to a smaller indie shop or a smaller studio. But that's probably not where we start. We're focused more on somebody who's aspiring to create, a giant video game that can scale to millions of players. That is a rich, deep kind of online service-based game.
Got it. And so if I'm translating this for a dumb executive, like myself. Maybe you can, check me in terms of my translation of what you guys have talked about. So one, access to source, so you can do a lot of, deep customizations if necessary. Two, there's a lot of, to your point, Eden, a lot of the devil's in the details in terms of, I can say, company A has a match 3 game, company B has a match 3 game, but there's a lot of specific nuance in terms of how you guys implement the features. 3, scale, which is that you guys have built this thing to be massively scalable. And probably 4, in terms of this last statement that you made around simplification. So you guys are trying to make this thing as easy to use as possible, possibly with the added advantage of maybe reducing your requirement for DevOps and operations, basically. Is that a good characterization?
You're hired. Yeah, no, that's exactly, that's exactly right. No, I think and to Nick's point too, as well, it has a lot to do with, when you talk about something like matchmaking, again, there's so many different ways to do matchmaking, and might make sense for us to go into that a little bit, more. But importantly, if someone has a view on matchmaking and they're a managed service, you cannot again change the philosophy of matchmaking that they've taken. You automatically inherit their version of matchmaking. So it's not so much that we think we have the most superior, I mean, maybe we do, but even if we didn't, it's not so much that we believe that we can build the best matchmaker in the world. It's the fact that we know that we can't build a matchmaker that works for everyone. So that again, I guess that's to your first point. But I just wanted to sort of nuance, like, even when you're talking about, us saying, oh, the devil's in the details, but those details also are different for every person. So.
Right. So maybe we could talk about that. So matchmaking, I think from a user perspective, they're like, well, I just get matched and somehow things happen. But certainly, depending on, for competitive multiplayer games, there's a lot of different matchmaking types of systems, right? And whether it's like, even between, like, even on the mobile side, I'm more used to the mobile side, but like a Clash Royale versus a Arena of Valor has very different types of systems. Also, in terms of like matching with bots, what they do, like a bot heavy game like a Call of Duty Mobile versus another game that doesn't have a lot of bots, like Vigor on Xbox, and then you're waiting like forever. So like, could you talk to us about? So you tell me, what are the key challenges with matchmaking, and what are some of the customizations that studios should be thinking about when it comes to matchmaking?
Yeah, so this is an area I spent about 5 years on while at Riot, and so it's something that I'm kind of passionate about, and it's just a fascinating space. It's one that, like, the more you unpack it, kind of the deeper the rabbit hole goes, so to speak.
Right.
So, at the very top for matchmaking, you just think about, okay, what's our goal? And it's like, you want to connect players together such that they have an excellent gaming experience.
Right.
And one of the immediate challenges you face when you start doing matchmaking is, who's going to win that match, or who's most likely to win. And so the interesting thing is that your goal would be that everyone wins about 50% of their games, right? Because if you're trying to make fair matches, then you win half, you lose half. Well, that can already put a challenge on you as a game developer, because winning only half your games might feel poor. And this is actually where bots come into into play. But so at the highest level, we want to make a great game experience. You have this fundamental trade-off between speed and quality. So you can just do what we usually refer to as warm body matchmaking, which is if somebody shows up, we just pair them off and start the game, versus like skill-based matchmaking, where you've got an ELO or a true skill kind of system, a lot of heavyweight math trying to calculate. And what matters, I guess, is making a choice where on that spectrum you want to live. Do you want to prioritize just throwing people together? Well, the trade you're making then is that, the quality bar is going to be very different. Some games you might get to crush your opponents and win quickly. Other games you might be the one getting crushed. And so those dynamics are not as simple as they might seem at first, because, for example, if you say we aspire to make the tightest matches possible, there's a term called sweaty matches, which is, it's a high intensity match when you're matched perfectly with somebody else. And so those tend to be a lot more stressful and they take a lot more energy. So if you're trying to make a very competitive esports based, ranked system, that's a great kind of thing to pursue. If you're trying to make a casual game that's more about fun and just throwing in, then you actually might want to keep those boundaries a little looser. So those are the kinds of trades you want to make. And to create a matchmaking system, it both has to scale to allow all those users to come in at once. Then it also has to be tunable, and you have to have all the metrics and analytics data and processing and graphs to look at the profile, and then all the tools you need to tune and optimize and change those things. So that gets into kind of the quality and time trade. Bots play an interesting role in that, because one, if you play against a bot, there's the convenience that you can always have somebody, a player to beat up on. On the other hand, it can feel, sometimes players don't like to play against bots if they don't intend to. And so there's a lot of questions, especially on the mobile space, about, do you disguise that you are playing against bots, things of this nature. Just to unpack a whole nother kind of category, there's kind of the difference between what we call automated lobbies versus server-based matchmaking. So back in the old days in BattleNet, you would have a list of games that somebody had crafted, and you'd have a lobby host, and you would just kind of scroll down the list. And maybe they would say, hey, players of this rating only, but there was no automated matchmaking. So some of the early efforts were just tools to make lobbies automated, which is the player downloads a list of games, and instead of seeing it visually, you might write a little algorithm to match them together. The difference with this is It's going to be a much more casual experience because it's client authoritative. The client gets to choose which player it's matched up against. So it's hard to enforce, competitive integrity and things like this. It's hard to do deep analytics on that kind of experience. And so this gets also back to some of the product differentiation. Automated lobbies are very easy to implement, but don't really achieve that rich service-based game experience that you might expect from a more modern competitive game. So if you're making something, oriented towards esports, for example, you're going to need that richer server-based matchmaking.
Right, and most of the existing matchmakers are sort of automated lobby experiences. So that's again, like everyone can say they have matchmaking, but when we talk about matchmaking, we're talking about server-based matchmaking. So just to differentiate something like that where, and again, not everyone needs server-based matchmaking either. So not necessarily saying one's better than the other, but that's just the approach that we're taking as a service-based matchmaker.
And when you're talking to customers or, from your experience at Riot, like what are the primary, just to go back to a point you were talking about, Chris, in terms of, the different objectives. So, if I were to think about it, one of the things you mentioned is you can try to optimize against match times, right? So just try to get people in a game as quickly as possible. The second you mentioned is just the player experience, so that you try to get to that, whether it's a 50% win rate or, I would advocate for more of a 55 to 60% win rate. But so there's that. And then, and then are there any other like objectives that people think about as a product manager or designer in terms of making sure that the matchmaking is optimal?
Yeah, I think that so a couple things to kind of dig into that landscape a little deeper. One question is like where you're at in the life cycle of your game. So if you're launching a brand new title and you don't yet have a large user base, for example, I would definitely recommend just as a default instinct that you want to prioritize match times, because the worst feeling for players is jump into a new title and it feels empty or the match times feel long.
Right.
So you have to be really conscientious about that. Another factor that's very importantly related to that is how many different queues. So for example, let's say you have an adventure, a cooperative online adventure game where you're partnered up with players. If you have 30 locations on the map and players are matched based on each map, you've broken your population into 30 pieces. You're almost never going to have great match times, even if you just have it in that kind of like warm body take anyone mode. So you have to be really conscientious on your game design that you don't want to create too many distinct matchmaking buckets. And that's a really common mistake. You can see like, I'm trying to think back. I think it was the first Star Wars Battlefront, very shortly after launch, because they had 20 discrete matchmaking maps and they asked players to select a single one, even though there were a lot of players playing in that moment. If you picked the wrong map, if you didn't know what was popular because you were brand new, you could sit there for 15, 20 minutes while the map right next to you that you didn't click on, has tons of players flowing through it. So those are some really critical kind of considerations to make.
Right. Just kind of as we're speaking, just kind of thinking about other potential things to consider will be like, for example, Supercell and Clash Royale accounts for losing streaks. So they put losers in the same bucket so that you eventually win. Then also probably like ping times too, right? So like trying to get people that are geographically close together or have low relative ping times together. So yeah, I guess you can create a fairly complicated matchmaking.
It's crazy.
That is the problem with matchmaking, is because the natural tendency that we have is to add axes by which we want to matchmake, right? You're like,
right.
I'll add language. Okay, time zone, experience in the game. Everything like would indicate that it should make a better match, and then you end up with the population problem that Chris was talking about. You're like, well,
right.
I have 5 people in this Venn diagram I've created.
Yeah, and especially if you have like a progression-based game, right? Like a Clash Royale, where there is a little bit of, my cards are going to be different from your cards, but then you're also then wrapping in skill against the progression of your cards and units, and the further that is, the further that spreads out your population. So
could be anything like roles and. In league
monetization status, like you just
yeah.
Like I've bought all the super flamey swords and I stomp everybody, right? Like does that feel good? Is that not? It's a very, very complicated thing. Every time you add a variable to matchmaking, it makes it much more complicated.
Right.
Grading the performance correctly with a smaller population is both art and science.
Right. Now, I will say this, like as a potential customer of your tools, I will say that maybe the technology that I would really appreciate that if you guys put into your matchmaker would be something that's basically like a discovery algorithm that basically says, okay, we're gonna run a bunch of different matchmaking algorithms and just automatically, like more multi-arm bandit style, try to determine what are the things that, so as Chris, you mentioned, you're going to tie the matchmaker to like different potential KPIs or outcomes, so that, if you say, okay, well, if we have shorter match times, then my ARPU curve or my retention profile looks like this based upon what that looks like. Or if I have better player experience, that's going to lead to better outcomes. And so, like, again, just as a potential customer, if you guys could create that kind of discovery algorithm that tells me this is the optimization that makes the the user experience a lot better, or that improves our KPIs, that would be fantastic.
Yeah, no, I think that's, I think you touch on a really crucial point in this, that it's not just about the matchmaker successfully pairing players together, but it is that analytics pipeline. It's that ability to observe what's going on. And given the complexity of the space, this is another area that I'm really excited to be, working on Pragma, is to put sane defaults in place and to help people kind of get started in the right direction. And one of those factors is it is very easy to start adding variables, like Nick points out. And as soon as you start interleaving so many cross sections, anybody's ability to even reason about what's happening or why kind of goes out the window. And so one of the kind of guiding overall principles you want to take is use as few variables as possible. So which is a little bit counterintuitive, because you think more is better oftentimes, but it turns out that if you turn one dial and it moves 6 different metrics in 6 different directions, it turns out that you just, even if you build all the analytics. So one of the things that we care a lot about is, one, supporting that stats pipeline and making it accessible for people to hook that into, big data processing tools and frameworks and visualizations. We'll have some of that out of the box, but we're also going to make sure that it's easy to integrate into the already standard, robust analytics packages. But then the next thing I think we can strive towards is providing that foundation that says, here are the key matchmaking criteria that you should start with, and just helping people to understand that adding more is not always going to help them. And then if you can tie that back to what you're talking about, which is establishing which KPIs, long-term retention, is still going to drive up your LTVs, but it may not affect your ARPU right immediately. And so you can see those kinds of trades where you can optimize for short-term conversion of like, oh, if we sell power, then the players feel stronger and then they buy more and we see the numbers go up. It's like, oh, but if that hits your long-term retention, because like all your players are churning out, then in the end, it actually could do you more harm. And so I think there's definitely the desire to both make those analytics available and then also provide some of that kind of guidance or sane defaults and kind of help people see how to start optimizing.
Yeah, and then I can definitely see the value proposition that you guys are coming forth with, because as a game studio trying to work on a game and then having to think about all this other crap, oh, we got to build this and this and this, and it's just like, shit, let's just buy the off the shelf solution from someone else who's figured it out. So
yeah, and like I think that's why in a lot of ways it's not just the technical challenge of building a platform. I think I started off saying like we all love games.
Yeah.
And if you don't, even with something like, like all the things that we're talking about, matchmaking, reputation, behavior, good outcomes mean that the player has a good experience. And if you don't understand games, but you just understand tech, then you don't understand how that tech may translate into a bad player experience, for example. So it really does come down to how do you make a better player experience, even with something like matchmaking. And matchmaking is like everything in some ways, because if you just get stomped every game, you're going to feel, no matter how good the game is, you're just going to feel like this game sucks.
Right. And one of the other challenges with matchmaking is the cross-platform aspect. So maybe we could actually dive into that. So certainly when we are able to power cross-platform, it kind of helps in the sense that it gives you, especially if you have a thin population, depending on the type of game that you have, it'll help you get that additional CCU for matchmaking. But could you guys talk about some of the things you guys think about with respect to challenges and considerations as far as cross-platform is going? I think from the industry perspective, and if you talk to venture capitalist guys, they're always going to be like, oh yeah, cross-platform is the future, blah 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 blah. But in terms of like some of the technical challenges and maybe some of the services you guys are thinking about, how are you guys thinking about cross-platform?
Yeah, at the absolute highest level, I think there are two different kinds of challenges. There are technical challenges and business challenges.
Okay.
The business challenges relate to the fact that a platform provider, so this could be your Xbox Live or your PlayStation Network or your Steam or your Epic Store, they have a vested interest, obviously, in growing a user base on their own platform. And so there's a lot of artificial barriers that are in place about restrictions on how you facilitate cross-platform play. And to their credit, I think with Fortnite's success, Epic has been very active at trying to break those barriers down because they believe it'll benefit players to be able to play anywhere, cross-platform. And there's been really interesting and kind of valuable stories of players saying, "Oh, I haven't talked to my Xbox friends since I picked PlayStation like 8 years ago, and now we can play together." And so I think there's something really valuable for the social dynamic and the social ecosystem. And so that's just the business side. The technical side comes with a whole host of challenges, and some of those cross right back to the business because some of those challenges are having to customize the technical solutions based on the platform restrictions. So at a fundamental level, you have to have a shared account that is connecting all these different other accounts together. So you might be able to log in with your game login or your Xbox or your PlayStation. So there's a bunch of sophistication around just creating an account system that is shared between all those. Then you have to account for rules about, like, you might not be able to show an Xbox logo on a PlayStation, so you have to customize even the UI and the friends list and how those things interact. And then you get into the actual kind of cross-play, cross-progression stuff. So cross-progression is simply that if I log in on two different platforms, I log into one account and all my account data is there, which is kind of sounds obvious, but there's, if you saved all the data on somebody's Xbox user ID and then they log into a PlayStation, well, it turns out like you don't even have the identifier necessary to load that data. So something as small sounding as that can be a barrier. And for example, Minecraft Dungeons right now is struggling with that because they actually have cross-platform support, but they don't have that integrated account representation fully fleshed out at this point.
Now, is there any technology that addresses some of the gameplay sort of challenges when it comes to cross-platform? So, as an example, if you're playing Call of Duty Warzone and someone's on a PC and mouse versus someone else on a using a console controller, they're just going to get. I mean, there's going to be no contest, right? Or even like when I play Call of Duty Mobile, and I pair my controller and play someone who's just using their fingers, I'm going to destroy those guys as well. So, is there any technical way to solve some of those gameplay challenges, or you're just going to have to assume that if the different platforms are going to have a different level of skill associated with those platforms?
Yeah, I mean, I think it also depends on the game because there are going to be very, if
Sure,
you're talking about like turn-based
Clash
games,
Royale, it does.
yeah, exactly. That's exactly right. Yeah, I mean, you're talking with FPS for sure. Like a mouse and keyboard is going to be hugely advantageous.
Right.
Fortnite has had that cross-play kind of deal. I think, there's so many decisions there. I think that are really left to the individual ultimately to make. I mean, our view is that even with mobile, we don't necessarily feel like the best experience for the player is to have the same mobile experience as they have on like their console.
Right.
And we've talked a lot about like what it looks like to have companion applications where it's not just Fortnite on my phone that looks exactly like, because playing Fortnite on your phone is not a good experience for anyone. A lot of people just log on for the social experience. And so I think that's, as mobile and console PC start to become one industry a lot more in the next like kind of 5 years, I think we're going to see a lot more like companion applications where it's not just to your point, there is that cross-play, cross-progression type stuff, but it's not just like, oh, let's just have the same experience on all our devices.
Yeah,
because of partly what you mentioned.
Yeah, and on the technical side, the good news is there are technical solutions to this. For example, you can detect peripherals being attached to a mobile device. You can have your matchmaking queues broken off based on which platform you're logged into. And those are the kinds of features you're going to need to support cross-play and cross-platform. And that's definitely the kind of thing we'll be able to, for example, we have, the platform you're logged into is going to be core to how all these pieces fit together. So that'll be available to the matchmaker, for example. But again, you actually bring it right back to the matchmaking discussion, which is it does create a new vector. So it's something you have to be aware of. But yeah, so the good news is there are technical approaches to help address this, and it is ultimately a business and product decision. Like even back when Halo 1 went to PC, they started with cross-platform matchmaking, and suddenly it became apparent that using a mouse is a lot more effective. And there were even in-game ways that they attempted to address that, which is the controllers had a sticky aim system. And so it was a weird one, though, because how calibrated that was would affect, obviously, the ratio of kind of skill. And so if you overtune, an auto aim feature based on a controller, you actually might get to a point where you have a competitive advantage over a mouse and keyboard player.
Right.
Whereas if you left the two naive or by default, then the mouse and keyboard player would have the advantage.
So maybe shifting to our next topic about reputation and behavior, maybe I could actually even get you guys to define what this means for you guys. I think from my perspective, it's really about, more kind of two things. One is just like toxic behavior, like you get pissed off at people during a match and like, you fed the other team, you bastard, blah, 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 blah. And then kind of a second piece is more around not so much like the chat and stuff that happens during the game, but more around like some of the things that happen in terms of like player names. And, we saw that during the Black Lives Matter movement that, Activision had this big thing about trying to get rid of a lot of the racist stuff in Call of Duty Warzone. And, I think anyone who's played a multiplayer PvP game before has seen a lot of racism, right? And so like, just replacing G's with Q's or whatever, it's pretty bad. And so like, maybe you guys could talk to me about how you guys are interpreting reputation and behavior. And then, what do you guys, and if you guys have any products or what are you guys doing to address that?
Well, just one more thing to add to that on my end is not just the voice chat side, but there's also the whole side of if you're playing a ranked lobby and someone leaves in the middle of that game, how are you dealing with that person? Do you
should your score go down if you feed or not?
Right. So yeah,
these are the great questions, right?
Yeah, these are the gameplay questions outside of just like the hate speech stuff. But I know Chris worked on this for a long time, so I'll probably let him.
Yeah. So I mean, this is the area of most interest to me in games, and I think all of us ask ourselves like, is what I'm contributing to the world valuable? And having worked on behavior at Riot was something that really was fulfilling to me on a personal level, because it was nice to know that we were taking steps to try to first just understand the space, and then how do we build tools to kind of address this. And we learned a lot in that journey, and I was really glad to be kind of on the forefront of exploration and how we address these topics, even to the point where I think that there were outcomes and learnings we were taking away, even as big shops like Twitter and Facebook on the social media side were saying we don't know how to deal with this and address this. I think that intensity and the importance has only increased as we've seen so much kind of the dynamics of social media's influence on the world has been further explored and discussed recently. So at the highest level, I think that, again, you have to establish like, what are your goals first? On the one hand, you can say, hey, I don't want people, expressing hate speech. I don't want bad names. It is really frustrating to me as a parent to play a game that is otherwise pretty friendly, but then to not have any filters on usernames. And then it's like, oh, well, there's all sorts of kind of gross stuff going on. So there's a ton. The space is really complex. It's really deep. And one of the first observations there is, none of these are essential features to make your game go live. And because of this, it is oftentimes prioritized low, which is understandable, if you have a limited budget and you're trying to release a game. However, I think that we have an obligation to do better at this in this domain. And this is a huge part of my personal passion for Pragma, is we can get some of those foundational layers of technology and features in place so that we can then invest in these areas and create this toolkit that is no longer this, very expensive R&D, effort over 5 to 10 years for studios to kind of learn it from first principles. So that's like the high level. When we get into kind of the practical considerations, the first question to answer is, are you going to be an enforcing third party? So like as a game studio, do you decide which words are okay and not okay? and try to limit it that way. Obviously, I think there's a ton of problems with this, and so one of the first lessons we learned on Riot's behavior team was we need to give players the tools to build the communities they want, and there's a lot to unpack there, but it's important that we are not the authority sitting on the outside telling people you're allowed to say X, you're allowed to say Y. For all the buzzwords around AI and machine learning, this is a space that is very well suited to those patterns because, for example, you can build a chat sentiment model such that you use player reports of negative behavior compared to the actual data that's present in like chat logs, and you can build a model of what's okay and not okay to say based on player input. The model is not based on a list of words that you're not allowed to say. It's based on what players say is okay and not okay. There's a whole nother level then when you talk about a culture of it's easy. They talk about who's got the microphone. People who are loud and aggressive and noisy tend to grab a lot of attention. So there's a whole family of how do we reduce the volume of folks who are intentionally trying to create strife, and then how do we elevate the voices of those community members who are there to support and build up and encourage and mentor and build community. And you have to explicitly pursue that. And I think this is an area where you see something like Twitter. You are rewarded as a Twitter user for saying inflammatory remarks because it grabs attention, and attention results in likes and shares and discussion, and that builds your reputation. So you have to be really careful that as you build reputation systems that you don't just reward the loudest voice, you actually reward the things that you want to see in your community. And ideally that should be represented by what players want to see, and not a vocal minority who are just the loudest, but also not like what the game studio themselves have decided they like or don't like, within limits though, because then there's also the question of how much obligation do we have to stop things like that are prejudiced or
Right.
addressing hate speech and things in media.
Yeah, I do think that this is an area that's going to become increasingly important. I mean, I think that the Black Lives Matter movement kind of highlighted the need for more enforcement here, and we've seen that this is turning into because we've seen Activision kind of crack down on this. We realize this is going to become more of a business case and something that we're going to have to invest in, which is I think is a good thing, and also because if we invest in it, it all of a sudden also broadens our audience. Like I've got young kids. I'm not going to let them go into a game where there's a lot of weird, racist, blah, profane speech, all that kind of stuff. And so the better these tools are at getting rid of that, I think that will allow your age demographic to age down as parents kind of okay their kids to kind of play some of those games. But I would say that as a potential customer, I do think that it would also be useful if for you guys to just start with like a template saying, okay, look, because I don't want to as a game studio exec say, okay, well, we need somebody go look up the 500 words we're going to block, and you do this, and every game studio is doing that on their own today, right? And kind of coming up with their own rules and things like that. But if someone could at least start with a template and say, here's our list, then it's like, okay, well, let's use the Pragma bad words list 5.6, and then we'll just modify that or add these things or whatever. So from a customer perspective, I do think it might be useful for you guys to get into also that content part of it, just to save potentially the whole industry a lot of time.
Right. And I think to Chris's point, there's the tools to allow the players to
right. Yeah.
And then there's and then there's also the things that we don't want to allow as an industry. So I think those are two separate things. But I think to the business case of this entire thing, one of the things at Riot was that they saw hate speech and these types of things, prejudice and whatnot, being one of the number one reasons for churn in the game.
Right.
So it's very, very difficult to sort of calculate the business loss that happens because of hate speech and all these things without running lots and lots and lots of studies at massive scale. But we know from a audience that's the size of Riot that was one of the top reasons for churn. And we also know that most studios do not have the time to go and build these tools out. So I think there's the moral obligation, but there's clear business use cases that have not been explored. And I think that's a really cool opportunity for us to both make the world a better place, but also hopefully make game developers more money too as well.
Right. Okay, then maybe coming to our final topic, which is just around scaling challenges. And I think that I kind of think about this in a couple of ways. One, certainly scaling a lot of things that a lot of the services you guys are doing, but also I thought it was interesting as we're seeing more integrations with like real live events and things like that, being able to scale services for custom events and things like that. Like, for example, in Fortnite, there was a Travis Scott concert, and just to put some stats in terms of scale, it had like 12.3 million players that participated. And so even for non-game related things, if you're doing an event or something in game, that scale may potentially have a big impact. And so, maybe you guys could talk about, what are some of the challenges associated with scale that you guys are going to take care of, or that are generally like a pain in the ass for game developers to address when it comes to a lot of these online services.
Yeah, I can take that one. Everything about scaling a complex backend system is a pain in the ass. The only difference is that we love doing it. And so that's why we want to do it. It's a matter of perspective, really. So games are, in many ways, the worst possible thing to try to scale. Right? They have that weird thing where they don't exist until launch day, and then out of nowhere, they exist. And then we try to get everybody's attention, and everybody comes at once, and they go, "I want to try this game." And so, without having like gone through a growing up process, right, they're expected to be fully grown adults running at full tilt. And many games are launched with peak concurrent user on day 2 or 3 or 4, and it will then decrease to stabilize afterwards. But the Steam masses have come, have played the game, everybody's tried it, and this is a tremendous volume of pressure, right? And you don't get a second first time. People will only judge you on your first launch, not, even for all that, Realm Reborn has tried to relaunch, we still all remember its terrible failure the first time. And so it is hard because you don't get the chance to do it and to discover where you went wrong. So if you build it yourself, you have to get all those little places that can go wrong when 100,000 people press a button at the same time. They all have to be right. And if you miss up just one, then the server don't work well, and that's all that people will remember. They'll be like, error 37. That's what I remember of this game. It was great, cool error message. So it's unforgiving, is what it is. It's completely unforgiving, and it's so bad that even the big shops like Riot, right, like who have operated League of Legends, giant game, we're still shy. They still do private launches. They still try to do Twitch drops and feed people into the system to make sure it warms up and that we suss out the problems. So if even a giant shop with like crazy good engineering benches are shy, like what hope do you have as a 15 engineer AA studio making a cool game to like get your backend right? It boggles the mind that people would think that it has a high likelihood of working, right? And the cost of failure is so high.
Yeah, I can actually
terrible.
give you a specific example, Nick. Even a big company, so Electronic Arts, when they first launched Simpsons Tapped Out, they launched the game, the servers melted, and then they shut down the game for 6 months. So the game was down for 6 months until they fixed it. Then they relaunched. I mean, ultimately it was successful. But you think about it, like if they had figured it out, they could have had 6 months of additional revenue. But yeah, to your point, it is a big deal. And then you see from a huge company. So
yeah, and then like it's only half the battle is making it. The other half of the battle is learning how to operate it.
right.
And this is generally trial by fire for most people. You build your game, you launch it, and then you figure out how it actually works when faced with 1 million users, and you grow your team commensurate to the complication that you've created for yourself when you cobble together your backend. And the more cobbled together it is, the bigger the team you now need to operate it live, and the more failure cases you're facing. So that scale of going from works on my machine to works for the world is gigantic and difficult. In many ways, like Chris said it at the start, it's like trying to build Netflix at the same time as Pixar and hoping you land both. The cool video game that would be a Pixar and the cool online services that would be your services. And that's quite difficult. Then on scaling your studio and your game for longevity, which is the domain of online experiences, right? They stay with us for many, many years, and we engage with them for many years, and we love them for many years. If you started by custom crafting your backend, somehow you made it through launch, and the people have still decided to enjoy your game and stick with you. You learn how to operate it. Now you're faced with yet another problem, which is your code base is in a disastrous state, and this is a truism that happens every single time. You had to emergency learn how to do this. You did it in whatever way it could work, and your code base is in a rough state. And now you need hundreds of engineers to do anything, and it will slow you down for years and years to come. This could have been avoided if you'd started from some known good base thing, right? But we don't do that. So we're faced with these problems. The crux is what works for 1 person or 10 person or 100 person teaches you nothing, or just about nothing, of if it'll work for 1 million. You know, in anything, you can make a lemonade stand for 100 people, and you can easily think about how to make it work. But if I tell you need a lemonade stand for 1 million people, you don't even know where to get the lemons. Like it's a completely different question, with a completely different skill set. I think that's why it's so hard to scale them. And you know, we want those things. We want those crazy scales. The world wants those crazy experiences, like the 12 million, or I don't know, what was it, 15 million to the players in Fortnite for the concert or something like that.
Yeah, I think it was 12.3 million players for the first concert, and then across all 5 is 27.7.
Right. So that means you need systems that, sure, they weren't all in the same Fortnite game at the same time. You couldn't see 10 million people on your screen. That would be ludicrous. Yeah. But yeah, still they were connected and watching the same experience and sharing something together, which is crazy. So we want more of that, right? We want more of those crazy big scale things, and they're just blatantly hard to do. If they weren't hard to do, like we wouldn't be talking about them as such a big event, right? They wouldn't capture the imagination so much as they do today. Yeah.
Right, and even that, like we said, they broke us down to 100-person instances. I think. Yeah. I mean, that's just how hard it is. Like,
right.
Well, I mean, the feat in and of itself of doing what they did is crazy. But then you also they still couldn't put them in the same room, right, or even get more than, putting 100 people in the same room is, hugely challenging. That's why even with the whole battle royale phenomenon, I mean, that's like the fact that we have the ability to play battle royale today is something that is, extremely, interesting. Wouldn't have been possible like, very recently.
Okay, well, I think that's all of the topics. Maybe in terms of, Pragma, Eden, is there a good way for people to find out more about what you guys are doing? And maybe you could tell us a little bit in terms of like your product offering and when some of that stuff will become available.
Yeah, totally. So, if anyone has any questions about anything, it doesn't have to be about Pragma. It could just be about, questions on backend systems or whatever. It's just our first name at pragma.gg. So Nick, Chris, Eden at pragma.gg. I'm on Twitter at Eden Chen as well. So you could just, feel free to get in touch
I'll
with
add
us.
all those links in the show notes for sure.
Yeah. And then in terms of like roadmap and whatnot, we are working with a kind of what we're calling like design partners. It's a very small set right now of customers that are working with us to build the product. We're of the philosophy that it makes sense to build a product with an actual customer and not just go in a cave and build something that we think people need and then, hoping that people will sign up. So we're working with one right now. We're probably going to take on an additional 2 to 3 over the next 6 to 12 months. And again, these are right now kind of what Chris was talking about, more of the AAA or AA, folks that have come out of. So they're more experienced teams that understand why these problems are so difficult and want to work with a team that's done it before. And our first sort of game will be launching sort of early next year, end of this year in closed beta. And then our offering will be likely open to more of like, in a more public state, I'll say. I don't want to say in a completely open public state, but probably by the end of next year. And I'm not going to be someone that just throws out dates and then Nick and Chris are like, "What the?"
Okay. Well, when you guys are ready, let's do another recording of some kind. We'll talk more. But okay. Do you have any other final message for our audience? If not, definitely want to thank you guys for your time and wish you guys the best of luck.
Yeah, I'd say like the final thing I want to say is the online services space is one that we're super passionate about, and we're wanting to see more communication amongst the space as a whole. I think as a discipline, a lot of people haven't even known that it was a discipline or there was a name for it. It was called lots of different things. GDC has done something called the Online Tech Summit, and created a bunch of talks around that specific discipline. And then IGDA is doing things around online services as well. So if anyone's in this space and interested in connecting, we just want to talk with you. It's something that we're passionate about, not just for Pragma, but as an industry as a whole, that we really hope we can sort of create a real kind of buzz around this specific discipline of like online services.
Got it. All right, awesome. Okay, well, again, thanks for your time, and I think that's a wrap. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks. Have a good one.
Thanks.
See you.